Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her in the break room 3 days into her employment at Mercy General, Norfolk, Virginia. Margaret Walsh didn't respond. She never did. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head like insects trapped in plastic, and she poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug with hands steady as surgical lasers, watching the dark liquid settle without a ripple. Around her, 2 residents laughed, the kind of laughter that needs an audience to survive. Sterling smiled. Margaret turned the mug slowly, reading the faded inscription, "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from Emma 7 years ago, before everything changed. She'd been at Mercy General for 3 years now. 3 years of arriving at 6:19 a.m., 14 minutes before shift. 3 years of moving through the cardiac unit like water finding its level, present, essential, utterly unremarkable to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Which was everyone. The younger nurses called her quiet. The attending physicians called her efficient. Dr. Sterling called her the church mouse, a nickname that had calcified into routine use by the time most of the staff realized it was meant to diminish her. Margaret didn't mind. The invisibility was useful. She moved through the east corridor now, her scrubs pressed to hospital creases, her dark hair pulled back so tight it pulled her temples smooth. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a permanent weather pattern, acrid, chemical, the scent of systems being sterilized. Under it, something else. Copper. Someone had coded in Trauma Bay 2 last night. She'd heard about it. She always heard about everything, even when people weren't talking to her. The cardiac unit stretched across the 3rd floor in a careful geometry of rooms and stations. Room 347 was in the corner. She'd noted this 3 years ago when she'd memorized the entire floor plan on her first shift. Habit. Military habit. Know the terrain. Know the exits. Know where the supply caches are hidden and which staff member has keys to the pharmaceutical storage. Some habits didn't retire just because you did. The equipment room was her first stop. Margaret unlocked it with her badge, access that Sterling barely acknowledged, and began her morning inventory. Cardiac monitors. Defibrillators. The crash carts with their tidy rows of syringes filled with epinephrine and atropine, each one labeled with tiny precise handwriting that wasn't hers but that she'd learned to replicate for the sake of institutional continuity. She organized them with movements that belonged to someone else's body, someone who'd done this in field conditions. Intense. In the back of a Black Hawk helicopter over Helmand Province while rounds punched through the fuselage and the medic next to her screamed that they were losing the patient. That was 18 years ago. That Margaret was dead. This one, the one standing in the supply room at 6:52 a.m. on a Tuesday, was just a nurse. The faded unit patch was sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one hanging in her locker downstairs. It pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat whenever she sat down. The patch was olive drab now, nearly colorless, the stitching so old the thread had begun to separate from the fabric. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody knew what it meant. Not here. Not anymore. She finished her inventory at 7:14 and made her way to the cardiac unit break room for shift report. The space smelled like burned coffee and the faint chemical sweetness of artificial creamer. 2 nurses she recognized nodded at her. A resident scrolled through his phone. The attending physician, Dr. Carston, good hands, competent, was reviewing patient charts. Sterling hadn't arrived yet. He never did for 7:30 shift report. He liked to make his entrance at 7:31, exactly 1 minute late, which was a form of punctuality that mattered only to him. Margaret poured her second coffee and opened her own copy of the patient roster. She moved through it page by page, updating her internal map of the day. Room 301, post-op cab, stable. Room 312, arrhythmia monitoring, medication adjustment pending. Room 328, stress test scheduled for 10 a.m. Room 347, new admit, Army Ranger, Captain James Brennan, cardiac workup protocol. Her hand stilled on that line. Captain James Brennan. The name sat on the page like a detonator someone had forgotten to disarm. She read it again. Cardiac workup protocol. Routine. Which meant he wasn't here for anything acute. Which meant he didn't know what had happened. Which meant she was going to have to look at a man's face across 3 years and say nothing. Margaret. She looked up. Dr. Carston was holding out a patient file. Can you start the morning vitals on the new cardiac admit? Room 347. Get him settled, run the 12 lead before I finish rounds. He's going to be a bit of a celebrity, used to be active duty, just retired, came straight in for the workup his CO insisted on. His commanding officer. Margaret's voice came out smooth and low. Deferential. The voice of someone who'd perfected the architecture of invisibility. Yeah. Apparently there's some protocol when guys transition out. Medical clearance thing. Anyway, he's stable. Just routine monitoring. She nodded and took the file. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her expression didn't change. The part of her that had carried wounded men through minefields was still, the way a sniper goes still before taking a shot. Waiting. Calculating. The break room door opened. Sterling entered at precisely 7:31, his white coat moving around him like an expensive cape, his presence filling the room the way large men fill spaces, not through their actual size but through the assertion of themselves into everything. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 4 inches, with the kind of jawline that cut glass and the kind of confidence that came from never having anyone tell him no. His watch was a Rolex, the kind surgeons wore to advertise their billing rates. Around his neck hung a stethoscope he never actually used, it was purely ornamental, a scepter. He glanced over the room with the calculating gaze of someone assessing subordinates. His eyes landed on Margaret for a half-second. A dismissal. A catalogue. She was there. She was quiet. She was the church mouse and therefore functionally invisible. But then his gaze caught on something. The patient roster she was holding. Room 347. Captain James Brennan. He watched her face for a microsecond, a fraction of time so brief that anyone else would have missed it. But Margaret had been trained to notice things that happened in fractions of seconds. Trained by institutions that had long since classified her file under a designation so secure that it might as well have been a ghost. Sterling's expression shifted. Nothing obvious. Just a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. The kind of expression a predator makes when it detects prey. "Morning, everyone," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. Deep. Patient. Dangerous in its smoothness. Let's make this quick. I've got surgery starting at 8. Margaret closed the file. She rose from her chair and excused herself with 2 words, "Thank you, doctor," the kind of politeness that comes from being trained to disappear from rooms while drawing no attention. She moved past Sterling, and for just an instant, his cologne hit her. Something expensive. Something that belonged to someone who'd never had to wear the same uniform for 6 days straight in a desert where the temperature climbed past 130 degrees. The cardiac unit corridor was quiet. Most of the patients were still sleeping or in early morning stupor, their monitors beeping in conversational tones to each other. She made her way to room 347 and stopped outside the door for just a moment. Long enough to breathe. Long enough to be sure. She pushed the door open. He was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking out the window toward the Norfolk docks visible in the far distance. His face was older than the last photograph she'd seen, the one Emma kept in the locked box, the one from a memorial service Margaret had not attended. His uniform was gone, replaced by a hospital gown. His shoulders still carried the shape of a man who'd spent 15 years in the Army Ranger Regiment, but there was a softness to him now. Retirement beginning to undo the architecture of combat. He turned when she entered. Their eyes met for a breath. "Captain Brennan? I'm Margaret Walsh. I'll be your primary nurse today." His expression didn't change. No recognition. No memory of a woman who'd asked him once, 3 years ago, if her son had been brave. If David had understood what was happening to him at the end. "Morning," he said, his voice the careful neutral of a soldier in a hospital. Your CO said the workup was routine. Routine, Margaret repeated. She moved to the monitor beside his bed and began setting up the 12-lead EKG equipment with steady hands. Let's keep it that way. The break room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space where people ate lunch between emergencies. Margaret stood at the sink, rinsing a mug that had held chamomile tea, when Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the ambient hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent lights overhead. Anyone want to take the over-under on when our little wallflower finds her spine? The break room went quiet the way rooms do when a predator enters. 15 staff members turned nurses, residents, an orderly restocking the supply shelf. Sterling sat at the table nearest the window, his white coat unbuttoned, his shoulders occupying more space than his body had any right to claim. A $4,000 watch caught the light on his wrist. I've got money that says the church mouse doesn't make it another week, he continued, addressing his audience with the ease of a man who'd never heard the word no in a professional setting. Anyone want that action? A resident laughed. Another resident, a younger woman with dark circles under her eyes from a 16-hour shift, laughed because the first resident had laughed, not because anything was funny. This was how institutional power worked. It rippled outward, and people bent in its wake. Margaret set the mug on the drying rack with care. The porcelain made no sound. She took one measured breath, let her eyes meet Sterling's for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to the window. Her reflection in the glass showed nothing, no heat in her cheeks, no tremor in her hands, no sign that she'd heard him at all. She walked out past the gathered residents, her shoes making soft contact with the linoleum, and that was the only response Sterling got. Silence. A closed door. He didn't know what he'd just failed to accomplish. 3 days passed. Margaret moved through her shifts the way water moves through a sieve, present everywhere, noticeable nowhere. She charted medications with precision. She checked cardiac monitors with the quiet intensity of someone counting heartbeats like other people counted money. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then her words came out measured and thin as surgical thread. She'd learned long ago that the best defense against predators was to be beneath their notice. Invisible. Forgettable. Safe. But Sterling wasn't finished testing her. The hospital cafeteria on the third day was crowded. Hospital lunch crowds always were, the strange mix of staff and visitors and patients in robes shuffling between tables with trays that smelled of institutional warmth and sodium. Margaret stood in line, her blue scrubs making her indistinguishable from 30 other nurses. She'd selected a bowl of broth-based soup, a sandwich, a cup of coffee. Nothing that required 2 hands or careful balance. She carried her tray past the table where Sterling sat with 4 of his residents, the inner circle, the ones who laughed when he wanted them to laugh, who looked at him the way people look at lightning. They wanted to be struck by him, wanted his attention to illuminate them as worth something. Sterling's leg extended from under the table with the deliberation of a drawbridge lowering. Margaret's tray caught his shin. The physics of the moment were simple and absolute, momentum and angle and the sudden absence of forward motion. The bowl of soup launched upward in a slow arc. Time did that strange elastic thing it did in accidents, stretching into frames. The ceramic caught light. Broth hung in the air like a liquid cloud. Then gravity reasserted itself with the violence of consequence. The tray crashed to the linoleum with a sound like breaking bones. Soup splashed across the tile in a wide stain. Plastic dishes clattered, sharp, percussive, loud enough that the entire cafeteria went quiet. 100 people stopped eating. 100 sets of eyes found the source of the noise. Margaret was on her knees in the spreading puddle before anyone could breathe. Clumsy, Sterling said, not looking up from his phone. His residents laughed like it was a joke. Like her humiliation was entertainment. Maybe the church mouse needs better coordination. Margaret's hands moved across the wet floor, gathering broken plastic. A bowl. A spoon. A napkin soaked through with broth. She worked with the mechanical precision of someone performing a task that required no thought, no feeling, no presence. Behind her eyes, though, something shifted, not visible, just a settlement, like deep tectonic plates adjusting their weight. One tear escaped her right eye. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the mess in front of her. Not looking at Sterling. Not acknowledging the laughter. Just continuing her work, cleaning, sorting, erasing the evidence that she'd ever been there at all. She stood, walked to the trash, deposited the wreckage, and left the cafeteria in complete silence. The other staff members watched her go. Some of them looked away. Some of them kept their eyes on her, seeing something in her carriage that didn't match the scene they'd just witnessed. That was the worst part, the disconnect between how she moved and what they believed they'd seen. The next afternoon arrived with the kind of grey Norfolk light that made everything look photographed in winter, even though the calendar insisted it was summer. Margaret worked the cardiac unit's third-floor hallway, moving between rooms, checking monitors, adjusting saline drips with the muscle memory that came from 3 years of the same routine. Her hands knew this work. Her hands could do it with her mind somewhere else entirely. She was exiting room 312 when Dr. Sterling stepped into the hallway ahead of her, holding a patient chart. Their eyes met for a microsecond before he did it, the deliberate wind-up, the casual cruelty of a man testing gravity against a woman who worked too hard to deserve it. He threw the chart at her feet. Paper scattered across the linoleum in a fan pattern. Notes. Test results. Lab values. Vital signs. The architecture of someone's medical history, just released. Hanging in the air for a moment before finding the floor. Nurses and orderlies at the station froze. The whole hallway held its breath. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, loud enough for the nurses' station to hear. Loud enough for the residents coming down the corridor to hear. Loud enough for everyone to understand this was not a request. It was a demonstration. A performance. A man showing everyone who held the weight around here. Margaret took one measured breath. A single tear formed at the corner of her right eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the floor, or not in submission, just in acknowledgement of the water. Her voice, when she spoke, came out like still water, like the surface of something deep that could kill you if you went in. "I've carried wounded men through minefields, Doctor. I can certainly carry your paperwork." The hallway went so quiet you could hear the heart monitors beeping in the rooms behind closed doors. You could hear the fluorescent lights hum their particular frequency of anticipation. You could hear the intake of breath from 3 residents who suddenly understood they were in a room with something they didn't have a framework for. Sterling's jaw tightened. He didn't understand what she meant. His brain couldn't construct it, the specific weight of her words, the particular way someone speaks when they've already survived the worst and decided not to be afraid of anything lesser. He felt something dangerous shift in the air between them, some fundamental repositioning of mass and gravity, but he couldn't name it. Margaret knelt. She gathered the scattered pages. 16 sheets in total. She organized them back into order, vital signs first, then labs, then notes, then discharge information. She reassembled the chart with the care someone uses when handling relics. Then she stood and extended it toward Sterling. Their fingers didn't touch when he took it from her. She walked away down the third-floor hallway, her pace exactly the same as it had been before, her posture unchanged. Sterling watched her go, the chart held loosely in his hands, something in his expression shifting between anger and something deeper, the particular confusion of a man who'd just thrown a punch at water. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, after her shift ended, Margaret returned to the supply room on the cardiac unit where the equipment logs were maintained. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of institutional truth, white, sterile, unforgiving. She pulled the binders from the shelf. 3 years of purchase orders. 3 years of inventory reports. 3 years of numbers that should have matched but didn't. Surgical kits billed at rates 3 times the national average. Phantom orders for cardiac monitoring devices never received. Overnight stays for equipment supposedly delivered. The pattern was so obvious once you looked for it that Margaret wondered how it had gone unnoticed for this long, then realized that almost nobody looked. Almost nobody studied the administrative margins. Almost nobody cared as long as the patients got their medications and the machines beeped in reassuring rhythms. She photographed 3 pages with her personal phone, her hand steady, her mind moving through implications and consequences with the clarity that came from having already survived worse than whatever came next. But as she closed the binder and turned from the shelf, Dr. Sterling appeared in the supply room doorway. His expression had changed. The casual cruelty had been replaced by something more focused, a predator who'd caught a scent and was now investigating the source. "Working late, church mouse." His tone was different this time. Probing. Assessing. Not performative anymore. Genuinely interested in her answer. Margaret closed the equipment log with care. Just checking stock before the next shift. Sterling stepped deeper into the room. His cologne, something expensive and aggressive, arrived before he did. "You seem very interested in paperwork for someone who just pushes meds." She met his eyes without blinking. "I like things to be in order." He moved to the shelf and took the binder from her hands. His fingers brushed hers deliberately, a violation disguised as accidental contact. "I'll handle the administrative side. You handle the bedpans." He left with the binder. Margaret stood in the fluorescent hum of the supply room, the overhead lights creating a sound like insects, a particular frequency of industrial anxiety. She touched the unit patch through her jacket, feeling it press against her skin like a second heartbeat. That was when everything changed, though she didn't know it yet. The cardiac unit equipment log sat open on the break room table at 2 in the morning, fluorescent light casting everything in surgical white. Margaret's finger traced the supply order for the 3rd time that shift, her eyes moving between the printed inventory and the handwritten count she'd verified personally during the day. The numbers didn't match. They never matched, but tonight she finally saw the pattern, not random discrepancies, but a rhythm. A deliberate rhythm. She pulled the logs from the past 8 months, spreading them across the table like a combat medic reading vital signs. Cardiac monitor cables listed as 20 units per order. Her inventory count showed 13. The same gap, month after month. For pump chambers ordered in batches of 50. The actual stock held steady at 32. The supply company name appeared on every invoice, Meridian Medical Solutions, always with Dr. Sterling's signature authorizing the purchase orders. Always the same inflated quantities. Always the same shortfall between what was billed and what actually existed in the unit. Pain was data. That's what her battlefield training had taught her. The body tells you where it's broken if you know how to read the signals. This hospital was broken. The ledgers were screaming. Margaret's hands moved methodically through the files, cross-referencing supplier invoices against the hospital's actual usage rates. The pattern crystallized with the cold clarity of a 300-meter target at dawn. Meridian was billing Mercy General for supplies that never arrived, or if they arrived, were immediately redirected. Someone had to be taking the difference. Someone with access to approve the orders. Someone with the authority to oversee the cardiac unit's procurement. Dr. Sterling didn't just sign off on these orders. His signature was the gateway. His thumbprint on every falsified invoice. She calculated the numbers silently, her mind moving through them like a medic running through triage protocols. 20 units short each month times 8 months meant 160 units that didn't exist but were paid for. At $300 per unit for cardiac cables alone, that was $48,000 in a single line item. Multiply that across every piece of equipment in the cardiac unit, and the number grew into something that stopped breathing. $180,000, minimum. Possibly more. Money that flowed from Mercy General to Meridian Medical Solutions, and then, she had no proof yet, but she would find it, into Sterling's pockets. A kickback scheme so precise, so methodical, that it had taken her 3 months of quiet observation to even see the outline of it. Margaret closed the logs carefully. No one would know she'd been reading them. No one ever paid attention to the quiet nurse who moved through the unit like she was already a ghost. She tucked the files back into the cabinet and set her hands on the break room table, breathing deliberately through her nose. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The technique was old, learned in a place that no longer officially existed, for a person the army had erased from every record. But the breathing still worked. She thought of David. Thought of the casualty notification officer who'd shown up at her apartment 10 years ago with his dress uniform and the words that meant her son was gone, killed in action, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The same place where she'd earned the rank stitched into her jacket. The same war. Taken by the same conflict. And now the man who'd trained him, Captain Brennan, was sleeping in room 347 2 floors above this break room, recovering from a cardiac issue that should have killed him if she hadn't been there. If she hadn't remembered how. Sterling had no idea what he was looking at when he saw her studying those logs. He had no idea that the woman he'd mocked in the cafeteria, the woman he'd thrown a patient chart at like she was something to be discarded, had spent nearly a decade identifying insurgent supply chains in Helmand Province. Tracking ammunition smugglers. Following the money that bought weapons that killed boys like David. This was nothing. This was paperwork. She could read this language in her sleep. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling received the call from Meridian's director of operations at 7:15 that morning, while Margaret was already 3 hours into her shift, checking on post-surgical patients in the step-down unit. She didn't know he'd gotten the call. She didn't know that one of his business partners had spotted her in the records room the night before. Security cameras had picked up her silhouette under the break room lights. She didn't know that Sterling's phone had lit up with a single message: "Your problem is still studying the files." What Margaret didn't know was that the activation was already underway. Sterling spent the day making phone calls from his office behind a closed door. The first call was to Thomas Pierce, a board member whose daughter's tuition Sterling had paid for with unmarked checks, $12,000 a year for 4 years, money that technically came from his consulting fees but actually came from Meridian's surplus. Pierce picked up on the second ring. Sterling didn't need to say much. "I need a credential review initiated on one of the cardiac nurses. Margaret Walsh." Quietly. "Before Friday." Pierce said, "It's handled." The second call was to James Halloway, the HR director, who owed Sterling something much heavier, a career-ending indiscretion at a conference in Atlanta that Sterling had photographed and then promised to bury. "Margaret Walsh, cardiac unit. Pull her file. Schedule a credential verification interview. Tell her it's routine, new policy, random audit. Make her nervous." Halloway said, "When?" Sterling said, "Today." The third call was to the investigator, a man named Marcus Webb who worked in legal compliance for a firm 2 cities over. Webb had done work for Sterling before: background checks, document recovery, the kind of service that existed in the space between legal and necessary. "I need discrepancies documented in an employee's background. Her name is Margaret Walsh. She works in the cardiac unit at Mercy General. The fabrication doesn't exist yet, but it needs to when you're done." Webb said, "What kind of discrepancies?" Sterling said, "Employment gaps. References who might remember things differently if they're asked the right questions. A narrative that suggests she misrepresented her qualifications to get hired." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Margaret was being called into Halloway's office on the 4th floor, away from the familiar rhythm of the cardiac unit, into the fluorescent glare of administrative space where people were asked to explain themselves. Halloway sat behind his desk with a file folder that Margaret knew, with the cold certainty of someone who'd been trained to read threat assessments, didn't contain anything real yet. But it would. She could see it in the way he opened the folder slowly, as if he was reading from a script someone had written for him. "Just a routine credential verification," he said, his voice too practiced to be genuine. "New board policy. Random audits of personnel files." He looked up at her, and Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes, the knowledge that he'd been told to make her uncomfortable. "Your previous employment history. Can you walk me through the gap between 2013 and 2015? Margaret sat in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady as surgical steel. "Classified government service. Medical field. I can provide contact information for my handler, but the paperwork won't clear through civilian channels. Holloway's pen stopped moving. He hadn't expected that response. His script had included nervousness, stammering, explanation. What he got instead was a woman who'd just given him information that couldn't be verified or disputed because it existed in a system he couldn't access. The handler, he repeated. Pentagon liaison. The program was compartmentalized. Margaret's voice remained even. Your investigators can call the number on file with the VA. Someone will either confirm my service or deny my service, depending on what's been declassified. But they won't tell you anything else. By 6 o'clock that evening, Marcus Webb had already called for of Margaret's listed references, all fabricated nursing positions at hospitals that had employed her during the supposed gaps in her actual service record. 2 of the references were actual people, old friends who'd agreed years ago to play along if anyone ever called, and Webb had done exactly what Sterling had instructed. He'd asked vague, leading questions. You remember Margaret? Quiet woman? Good with patients? There's a question about whether she might have exaggerated her experience levels. Do you remember any gaps in her competency? Any concerns about her credentials? The friends had been confused, had said no, of course not, but their hesitation, their natural uncertainty about memories from a decade ago, had been enough. Webb had already begun drafting his report. References show potential inconsistencies with stated employment history. Pattern suggests deliberate obfuscation of background. By 8 o'clock, Thomas Pierce had mentioned to Chief Nursing Officer Carol Simmons during a chance encounter near the coffee station that concerns have been raised about the background verification process for one of the cardiac nurses, Margaret Walsh. The board's taking it seriously. You might want to monitor that situation. None of it was coordinated in any obvious way. That was what made it effective. It was the kind of institutional pressure that moved like water through cracks, appearing in different places, coming from different directions, creating the impression of systematic doubt rather than orchestrated sabotage. Margaret came home that evening and found Emma waiting on the couch, her daughter's face tight with worry she was too young to hide. Mom, you're home late. Long shift, Margaret said, and she meant it. She meant the credential interview, the feeling of Holloway's suspicious eyes tracking her responses. She meant the weight of lying to the hospital about why there were gaps in her employment, and the weight of the truth, that those gaps were classified, that her real work couldn't be discussed, that her actual identity was still officially erased. Emma stood up. Come sit with me. I made tea. Margaret sat, and Emma brought chamomile in 2 of the mismatched mugs they'd had since David died. They drank in silence for a few minutes, and Margaret felt her daughter's eyes searching for something, an explanation, a reassurance, a return to the woman Emma thought her mother was. Mom, Emma said finally, did something happen today? Margaret touched the unit patch through her jacket, feeling it press against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Nothing I can't handle, baby. Emma didn't believe her. Later, after Margaret had gone to bed and fallen into the thin sleep of someone who knew she was being hunted, Emma went to her mother's bedroom closet and found the small metal box on the highest shelf. The one Margaret had shown her once, years ago, and said never to open. Emma had never forgotten that prohibition. She'd never forgotten the way her mother's hands trembled when she touched it. She'd never forgotten the look in her mother's eyes, not fear, but a door closing on something that needed to stay locked away. Tonight, Emma picked the lock with a hairpin. The box opened like a wound. Inside, a purple heart resting on white silk. Beneath it, a bronze star with a V device for Valor. Ribbon striped in colors Emma had to research on her phone, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, 2 more purple hearts folded carefully in tissue. Beneath the medals, citations typed on official letterhead, the words Valor under fire, treatment of mass casualties, Helmand Province, 29 enemy combatants, 47 wounded personnel. And at the bottom of the box, a photograph, her mother in desert camouflage, a rank insignia Emma didn't recognize on her collar, her face darker from sun exposure, her eyes the color of someone who'd seen the worst the world could offer. Emma Googled the rank. Senior Chief Petty Officer. She read the service record attached to the photograph. Combat Medic. 17 years active duty. 3 tours. 2 of them in Helmand Province. Emma sat on her mother's closet floor holding the Purple Heart, the weight of it real in her hand, and finally understood why her mother never spoke about before. She understood the silence. She understood the job that required her to be invisible, to move through the world without claiming any part of it. She understood that her mother had lost David to the same war, the same province, and then had lost herself to the keeping of secrets that couldn't be told. That was when everything that would come next began to move into position. Captain James Brennan's monitor alarm screamed at 6:51 p.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of sound that cuts through conversation and muscle memory alike. The ICU night shift was transitioning, day nurses charting their final notes, evening staff settling into the rhythm of the 12-hour grind. His oxygen saturation dropped from 94 to 88 in 4 seconds. The on-call resident, Dr. Chen, rushed into room 347, her eye scanning the monitor before her training kicked in. BP 70/42 and dropping. Heart rate 142. The rhythm showed electrical activity without mechanical response, pulseless electrical activity. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing his heart like a fist closing around a bird. "Get Sterling," someone called from the doorway. "Get Sterling now." But Sterling was in the OR on the 3rd floor, 4 floors up, scrubbed in on a routine bypass that would take another 90 minutes. Radio silence. Unreachable. Brennan's monitor showed the next compression wave, another dip in blood pressure, another second of oxygen-starved tissue. Dr. Chen's hands began to shake. She reached for the pericardiocentesis tray with fingers that didn't feel like hers. The needle was supposed to go into the pericardial space, the fluid around his heart. 1 centimeter too deep and she'd pierce the right ventricle. 1 degree too shallow and she'd miss the fluid altogether. A man would die either way. His oxygen was 83 now. The attending physician was in another emergency. The resident's breath came in sharp, small gasps. Margaret appeared in the doorway in her scrubs, having heard the code announcement through the overhead speaker. She saw the tray. She saw the frozen hands. She saw Captain Brennan's face, older than his file photo, weathered by command and terrain, but undeniably the man who had written the letter about David. The man who had buried her son in Helmand Province and then come to this hospital 3 hours from her apartment, and she had known his name and had said nothing and had done her job. She moved without hesitation. Not a request. Not an apology. Just movement. "Step aside." The resident obeyed before her conscious mind caught up to the authority in those 2 words. Margaret's hands were already prepping the site, finding the landmarks by touch the way she had found them 12 years ago in a trauma tent with mortar rounds shaking the canvas. 4th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The angle of the ribs like a map written into muscle memory that never forgot. She opened the sterile field with movements like a dancer who had practiced the same choreography in the dark. The 18-gauge needle caught the light. Brennan's BP was 65 now. The room held its breath. The attending physician stepped back without being asked, and later he would tell investigators that he had never seen a nurse move with such terrifying precision. The needle found the pericardial fluid with the sound of a small release, the hiss of air escaping as she aspirated the blood compressing his heart. 20 milliliters came into the syringe. 30. The monitor began to climb. BP 68. 72, 79. Sinus rhythm returned like a door opening. Brennan's oxygen came back to 91, then 94. The attending physician whispered something, but Margaret was already securing the line with tape, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her face showing nothing. The work was done. The man was alive. She placed the syringe on the tray and walked out before anyone could ask where she had learned to do that, before anyone could look too closely at her eyes or ask why her hands had known exactly where to go. The room exhaled. Dr. Chen sank into the chair beside Brennan's monitor, trembling now that the crisis had passed. The attending kept staring at the door where Margaret had stood. Where did she come from? He asked no one. No one answered because no one knew anything except that the cardiac unit's quietest nurse had just saved a man's life with the kind of skill that belonged in a trauma center, not in a Norfolk community hospital passing suppositories and checking vitals on post-op patients. Dr. Sterling heard about it within the hour. He was out of surgery by 7:45 p.m., still in his scrubs, the surgical cap impression still visible on his hair. The chief nursing officer had called him directly. Margaret Walsh performed a pericardiocentesis on Captain Brennan without authorization. There's already talk from the attending about writing it up as heroic. Sterling, this is, he hung up before she finished. His face went white, then red, then the color of something that had been underwater for too long. She had saved a patient. That was the problem. That was the catastrophe. Because a saved patient meant questions about how, and questions about how meant looking at what the patient needed saving from in the first place, and if anyone started looking at Brennan's cardiac workup, they might ask why his equipment orders had been escalated from standard to premium at a cost of $1,200 per unit when the standard equipment was identical. They might notice that the premium billing code had been applied to 43 patients in the cardiac unit over the past 6 months. They might do the math that Sterling had done, the math that added up to $847,000. He made 3 phone calls in the next 40 minutes. The first was to the chief nursing officer. Unauthorized procedure. Scope of practice violation. She endangered that patient by performing a procedure outside her certification level. Terminate her. Today. I want her escorted out before the evening shift ends. The second was to security. Full compliance. Remove her from the building immediately upon termination. The third was to the investigator he had already activated weeks ago, the one with the fabricated background in hospital credentialing. Deploy everything. Now. I want her personnel file flagged, her references investigated, and I want documentation that her credentials were falsified. Make it airtight. Make it look like she lied her way into this job. The machine was moving now. The network of board members, the planted references, the fake investigator, all of it suddenly on a countdown. By 6 p.m., Margaret was called to human resources on the 2nd floor. The director, Mrs. Patterson, sat across from her with a prepared statement, the kind that had been typed by someone else and handed to her this afternoon with instructions. She didn't make eye contact as she read it aloud. Irregularities have been discovered in your hiring credentials. Your employment history contains falsifications inconsistent with the documentation you provided at the time of hire. Additionally, you performed a medical procedure today outside the scope of your nursing license, endangering patient safety. For these reasons, your employment at Mercy General is terminated effective immediately. Please collect your personal items from your locker and proceed to the exit with security. Margaret sat still for 7 seconds. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was flat water. I performed a procedure to save a life, which you were not qualified to perform. Security is waiting to escort you out. Margaret stood. The meeting was over. She had known this was coming, not the exact timing, but the inevitability of it. A woman who knew what Sterling was doing could not continue to work at Mercy General. A woman who had studied his billing codes, who had documented his discrepancies, who had looked too closely at the numbers, she had become a liability the moment she understood what the numbers meant. The pericardiocentesis had simply accelerated the timeline. He was acting in desperation now, moving before she could move, destroying her before she could destroy him. She walked to her locker in silence. Other nurses watched from doorways and medicine carts, their faces showing confusion, then understanding, then anger. Margaret didn't acknowledge them. She pulled open the locker and removed what was there, a mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a succulent that had been dying for months because she always forgot to water it, and a photograph of David in his dress uniform, his lieutenant bars catching the light, his face serious and proud and gone. Everything she had brought into this job, everything that had lived in this locker, fit into a cardboard box that one of the security officers handed to her. The box was thin. It bent easily. The security guard, the same one who had been polite to her every morning she arrived, wouldn't look at her as he escorted her out. The rain had started an hour ago. It fell in sheets against the glass doors as they walked through the main lobby. Margaret passed the pharmacy. Past the ICU waiting room. Past the cardiac unit where Brennan was alive in room 347 because her hands had remembered something she had never wanted to remember. Sterling watched from his office window on the 4th floor, arms crossed over his surgical scrubs, his face showing nothing but satisfaction. The security guard held the door. Margaret stepped into the parking lot. The bus stop was 3 blocks down, at the corner of Maple and 9th. She walked there without hurrying. The cardboard box began to soak through almost immediately. The succulent tipped sideways inside. The photo of David slid slightly to the left. She stood at the shelter, or what passed for a shelter, a metal frame and a plastic roof that wasn't quite enough. Headlights blurred through the rain. A bus pulled up and stopped. She didn't get on. Another came. She didn't get on that one either. Her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the one with the MARSOC emblem and the Ranger tab stitched so carefully that no one had noticed it in 3 years, pressed against her ribs. The box was coming apart in her hands. The coffee mug was going to break. The succulent was already dead. She could feel the rain running down her neck, underneath her collar, and she didn't move to stop it. The patch was still there. The proof was still there. The faded green and the stitching and the weight of 12 years of combat and 5 tours and 2 purple hearts that were sitting in a locked box that her daughter Emma had found. Margaret had told her not to look. Emma had looked anyway because 17-year-olds understood things that 38-year-olds sometimes forgot, that being invisible was not protection. It was erasure. And Emma was tired of erasing her mother. Margaret sat in her apartment the next morning still wearing yesterday's damp clothes, her hair tangled from the rain, when Emma arrived breathless carrying the locked box Margaret had forbidden her to ever open. "Mom, they need to see these," Emma said, not asking permission this time, and before Margaret could stop her, the girl was gone again, moving with purpose Margaret recognized from her own training, the kind of momentum that doesn't wait for approval. Emma walked into the packed emergency staff meeting where Sterling was announcing new integrity protocols to a room of residents and nurses, his voice smooth as oil on water, confident he'd already won. The door swung open. Emma stepped forward and placed the locked box on the conference table, her 17-year-old hand steady even as her voice trembled with fury and pride. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," Emma said, and the room froze. She opened the box and pulled out the medals one by one, laying them like accusations on the polished wood. A purple heart with its purple ribbon and golden heart. A bronze star with V device for Valor. Combat Action Ribbon. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Each one caught the fluorescent light like it was bleeding truth into that conference room. A Navy SEAL team leader who'd brought in a training accident victim 3 weeks earlier stood up slowly from the back row. His name was Holloway, and he'd been watching Sterling with the predatory patience of a man who'd learned to recognize lies in Kandahar. "Bronze Star," Holloway said, his voice dropping into something harder, something forged in sand and blood. "That's for Valor in combat." He picked it up. His hands moved like he was holding something sacred. Combat Action Ribbon. That means she was in direct fire. He turned the medal over. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. His jaw tightened. 2 purple hearts. His voice was getting quieter, which made it louder. And this one, he held up the last medal, smaller than the others but heavier somehow. "This is a Navy Cross." He looked directly at Sterling. "That's given for extraordinary heroism in combat. Not many people get this. Less than 1,000 in 50 years. The room went dead silent. You could hear the ventilator in the hallway, the beep of a distant monitor, the sound of Sterling's breath catching in his throat like a man learning to drown. His face drained of color, not the pink flush of anger but the gray pallor of a man watching his entire universe restructure around him. He gripped the edge of the table. His hand was shaking. Emma watched him with the kind of cold satisfaction that made Margaret proud and heartbroken all at once. That was when the doors burst open. 2 FBI agents in dark suits moved into the conference room with the kind of practice synchronization that came from 1,000 interviews, 1,000 moments just like this. The agent in front, name tag reading Vasquez, held up her credentials. Dr. Richard Sterling, you're being informed that our investigation into Meridian Medical Solutions and your account at Sterling Capital Partners has concluded. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh provided critical documentation that connected your fraudulent billing scheme to $2.3 million in unauthorized transfers over 36 months. Her voice was clinical, professional, the kind of voice that delivered verdicts. Your medical license is suspended pending federal charges. You're being arrested for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. She nodded to the second agent. He moved forward with cuffs that clicked open like the sound of a sentence being passed. Sterling tried to stand. His attorney, some pale man in the corner Margaret hadn't even noticed, started making protests that nobody was listening to. The second agent was already reading rights in a voice so practiced it sounded like a prayer. They cuffed him smoothly, efficiently, the kind of procedure that had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. 2 board members who'd been sitting in the third row suddenly found urgent reasons to leave the room, their faces the color of spoiled milk. News cameras waited outside the building, someone had leaked it, or maybe the FBI had timed it deliberately for maximum public humiliation. Sterling's perp walk was captured on 6 different cameras as they led him toward the federal sedan with his head down, his expensive suit wrinkled now, his wedding ring catching the flash of cameras like a dying star. The local affiliate ran the footage on loop for 18 hours. By evening, his name was being spoken in the past tense. Margaret wasn't there to see any of it. She learned what happened through a call from Captain Brennan, his voice steady but emotional in a way she'd never heard it. They found everything, he said. The kickback logs, the phantom orders, 3 board members' signatures. The investigation is federal. He's being arraigned tomorrow. There was a pause. Your daughter was remarkable. Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. Emma sat beside her on the worn couch, still holding the empty box, still riding the wave of what she'd done. I'm going back to work, Margaret said finally. Sterling lost his medical license and his career and his freedom. That's his consequence. I don't need anything else. But that wasn't entirely true. What she needed was to move forward, to prove that the person she'd been in Helmand Province didn't erase the person she'd chosen to become in Norfolk. What she needed was to save people without apology, without hiding, without the faded patch being a burden anymore. The hospital board called her that same afternoon with a formal apology and an offer, reinstatement with full back pay and a promotion to clinical educator for emergency medicine. The position came with a corner office overlooking the cardiac unit and a salary that would let her help Emma through college without the girl having to work at the diner anymore. Margaret said yes before they finished asking. 6 months later, Margaret walked past a strip mall on the corner of Redmond and 9th, her scrub still damp from an 18-hour shift where she'd taught 3 residents how to perform emergency pericardiocentesis on a simulation model, her hands moving through the procedure with the same precision she'd used to save Captain Brennan's life. The rain had started again, not the kind that beat down but the kind that fell quietly, almost apologetic, as if the sky was sorry for something. Through the plate glass window of a discount storefront, she saw a folding table with a banner that read Sterling Insurance Solutions in faded blue letters. Dr. Richard Sterling sat behind it in a suit that had cost maybe $300 new and looked like it had lost a war with gravity. His medical license was permanently revoked. His name had been removed from the hospital directory. His wife had filed for divorce, taken custody of their 2 daughters, and moved back to her mother's house in Charleston. 2 people walked past his table without slowing. He looked up as they passed, his face trying to arrange itself into a customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then he saw Margaret through the glass. Their eyes met. 1 second. 2. She didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't let even the smallest flicker of acknowledgement cross her face. Just kept walking in her scrubs with Captain Brennan's thank you letter in her pocket, the one he'd written after Margaret helped him process what it meant that her son had died, asking his commanding officer to tell his mother she'd survived. Worse, that David had known exactly who his mother was and had been proud of her for that. Margaret reached Mercy General and badged through the staff entrance, where her photograph now included her military rank in small print beneath her name, Margaret Walsh, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. The cardiac unit was busy. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed like a patient breathing through pain. She moved through it with the same measured competence as always, but now when she spoke, people listened with a different kind of attention, the kind you give to someone who has genuinely survived the worst. A young nurse, fresh out of her first year, asked her about field medicine protocols during a slow moment. Margaret touched the faded patch through her jacket and began to teach. The words came easily now. No more hiding. No more pretending that the hand saving lives in a Norfolk hospital had never saved soldiers in Helmand Province. No more erasure. Just the simple, powerful truth: she had survived, and everyone in her unit had known it, and her son had known it, and now the world knew it, and it didn't change a single thing about who she'd chosen to be. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and let me know, did Sterling get what he deserved, or should the consequences have been worse? And share this video with someone who needs to remember that quiet strength is still strength.